so pleased. We want to thank you for coming. We're welcoming you to our capstone event for Malden Reed's Beyond Fortune Cookies, Confronting Asian American Stereotypes. We have a number of wonderful organizations who have co-sponsored this event. We have GMAC, the Greater Malden Asian American Community Corporation. We have Malden Core. We have the Chinese Culture Connection. We have the Malden Library. We have Malden Access Television, Malden's Media Center, and we have our sponsor, Eastern Bank. We thank everyone for participating. We thank you all for coming. And I want to share a few words, but before I do that, we want to thank so much Councillor Winslow for coming to represent the City of Malden, who will say a few words.
Thank you. I just want to send the greetings of Mayor Christensen and the City Council. I know Mayor Christensen had another event tonight. He's being honored by Project Triangle. So there's only one of them. It's hard to believe, but he's definitely would be very welcoming here and wants to send his best regards, and also from the City Council. I think this is a great event to really help create more dialogue in the city, and really, it's talking about how to look at people and understand people as individuals. And sometimes the important thing is to understand the perceptions we have coming in as we meet people. So I think this is a great opportunity to really understand that dynamic, and really so that we can work to connect as individuals and see everybody as individuals in our diverse community. So thank you for coming out, and looking forward to hearing the discussion. Thank you.
So I want to just say a few more words just to give a little bit more context for tonight. And first, I also want to introduce myself. I'm Jody Zalk. I'm one of the co-facilitators for Malden Reed's, along with my co-facilitator, Ann Durso Rose, who is somewhere here. Wonderful. Hi, Ann. Thank you. And we have so many wonderful leaders. I'm not going to call everybody out here tonight, but we thank everybody for coming. We have so many really meaningful people who are looking to maintain these meaningful connections in the community. This is a capstone event for Malden Reed's. Malden Reed's is about picking one book for a year, and we maintain and do some programs around that book for the year. This year's book is The Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane, and we really wanted to be able to focus on the connections in our community with our Asian American community. And we're so pleased, as Councillor Winslow said, to be able to really understand people more, and really understand some of the challenges with really looking at stereotypes. We want to thank, again, all of our sponsors, including Eastern Bank and Ameriprise. We want to thank everybody for coming, and we really want to thank the panelists and the youth for organizing this. So thank you.
Okay, so this brings us to the panel section of our event. So to start off, hi, my name is Mona Wang. I'm currently a sophomore at the Boston Latin School, and I'm a Chinese American. And I'm also very involved in the Asian Students in Action Club in my school. To start off, we have Young-Jin Kim, who is the social media editor at NBC Boston and is the president of the Asian American Journalists Association, New England chapter. Prior to joining NBC, he reported for the Korea Times in South Korea. The Asian American Journalists Association supports API journalists and works to ensure fair coverage of Asian Americans. Next, we have Dr. Josephine Kim, who is the founding executive director of a nonprofit organization which aims to educate Asian Americans on issues of cultural and racial identity, mental health, career development issues, and many other things. She is a licensed mental health counselor and national certified counselor, as well as a faculty member of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, as well as the School of Dental Medicine. Next, we have Dr. Paul Watanabe, who has a PhD in political science from Harvard University. He is currently a professor of political science and a director of the Institute for Asian American Studies at UMass Boston. He has large amounts of expertise in American foreign policy, political behavior, ethnic group politics, as well as Asian Americans. Next, moving on to the youth part of our panel, we have Trisha Obsequio, who is a Filipina American She is an officer of the Boston Latin School's Asian American Students in Action, and she is also very involved in the Filipino Club in our school. Next, we have Vivian Dang, who is a senior at Malden High School. Next year, she will be attending UMass Boston. She is currently a part of A-Voice and has participated in the Asian Community Development Center in community outreach and civic engagement. And finally, we have Emelina Tran sitting right out front here. She will be the facilitator of our discussion. She is a Vietnamese American student and is also a sophomore at the Boston Latin School. She is the president of our school's Vietnamese Student Society. Thank you.
So our first question to the panelists, what does it mean for you to be an Asian American?
I guess I'll start.
Okay.
Oh,
No, you go ahead.
Is that okay? All right. So first of all, thank you so much for providing this opportunity to come out and talk to the community. It's always really inspiring to see youth-inspired events like this, youth-organized events. So for me, I would say being Asian American has a lot to do with straddling two continents and two different cultures. So having one foot here in the United States and in my case having another foot in Korea. So growing up here in the Boston area, oftentimes I felt like I was kind of like a foreigner even in my own country. I didn't see any representation of myself on TV, and a lot of times, you know, growing up in the suburbs of Boston, in being just kind of one of the only a few Asian students in my school, that was very challenging as well. On the other hand, when I'd interact with, you know, my Korean friends or Korean family, I wasn't quite Korean either. So it was kind of like being both, but not being either. So it's kind of an odd position growing up. But as I grew older and I started to embrace both of those identities a little more, it started to make a lot more sense. And so, you know, one of the first jobs I had in journalism was out in South Korea. So I got this opportunity to go to my ancestral homeland, learn all about it, learn more of the language, and really as a reporter dig into all the issues that make up this culture. So being out there, I could bring my American identity, my American education, my training as a journalist, and bring a really unique perspective to South Korea. And coming back here, I could bring all that I gained from being in Korea, being immersed in that culture, getting to know all the politics of East Asia, and bring that back to my work here in America. So it's really, really, as I've grown, what was once a challenge has really become this amazing resource for me. So I guess when I think about that hyphenated identity of Asian American, you know, it comes with challenges, but the more you embrace it, it really is a wonderful resource.
Oh, yeah, so what I was going to say was the Asian American term, it's just a way that I use to describe myself in a way that I can identify and relate to others. The Asian being the culture and the heritage that I have, and then the American being the new experiences that differentiate me from my family back at home in like the Philippines. And I feel that these two parts of the term, they can't be separated. They, alone, they wouldn't do myself justice, and I feel like having them put together is what makes me.
I believe that the word Asian American applied to me doesn't have a lot of difference between being an Asian. For instance, immigration is so current nowadays. It's hard to differ yourself from an Asian-born Asian to an American-born Asian. But for me, either way, we all carry the same. We all carry similar struggles, and we all carry similar challenges. And taking that along with us can be difficult, especially when we're considered the minority and we are considered. We've been considered foreign or different. And all that we can do now is to take the time to learn about it and take the time to educate others, because the more we educate ourselves, the little less different we may seem.
I feel like I could listen to the students all day, so thank you. I've definitely had my moments of both love and hate with my identity as an Asian American. Being a child of immigrants, your context really matters. And so we were in Virginia where really everything was very white. I'm not talking about, snow. I'm talking about going to school and being the only Asian. My older brother and I were the only Asians in our school, let alone any people of color. And so growing up in an environment like that as a child, what's interesting is you only know one thing about yourself, and it's what's reflected back to you. And so when I looked out into the world, I didn't see myself, as you were talking about. And so as a minority, the psychology does a really interesting thing because you really want to be majority. And so I spent a great amount of time when I was young wanting to be very white. I wanted to walk white, talk white, be white, eat white, smell white, anything white. And in my mind's eye, I had done such a good job of this that I really was kind of blonde and blue-eyed in my mind's eye. And at that time, I can truly tell you, I didn't like being Asian. In fact, I distanced myself from my parents because they were kind of a sore in my eyes. They were a constant reminder that I actually wasn't white. And so went through that period. But when I look back, because truly now I have this great appreciation and a love for being Asian American, but looking back, I wondered why it was that I had this self-hatred about being Asian. And it really was because there was no representation. It also was because there was a lack of understanding the great history of Asian Americans in this nation. I mean, you saw out there the panels and the immense contributions that Asians and Asian Americans have made to this country. And that's a source of pride. And yet, if that information is not given, right, to you as a child, you don't really know that there's so much to be proud of. And so now I understand, I truly stand on the shoulders of giants and other people who have sacrificed so much for my freedom and the ability to stand here today as an Asian American. And now I boldly proclaim that I'm Asian American with great pride.
Thank you. I think it's kind of a funny question because people ask me what I am, and my kids say I'm a professional Asian American. So it's I run a research institute that focuses on Asian Americans, one of the few in the country. I spend so much of my time working in Asian American community-based organizations and others. I do a lot of my research on Asian Americans, so I'm sort of, I guess, a professional Asian American. But the resonance of Josephine's points really strike me. It is something that I am. It's part of my identity. And it doesn't mean it's been easy to embrace it. I remember, it's so funny listening to her. I made this notion that my father, whose name was not Steve, was Steve, and that he was a pilot in the U.S. Air Force, which he was not. He was Japanese, and placed in a concentration camp by the U.S. government during World War II. So I created this alter personality. And I think I probably wanted to embrace it just like she did. But Asian American has been a part of my identity, and we have many other identities. I'm a Japanese American. I'm an Asian American. I'm a person of color. I'm an American. I'm a human being. I'm a person. And sometimes all of those elements, and certainly those that have to deal with being a person of color or being an Asian American, have been problematic. They've been weighed on us, either as a collective or as individuals. They've been a source of prejudice and marginalization and so forth. But they've also been a source of great refuge, of great pride, of great realization. It's so wonderful to be Japanese American and think of yourself as something bigger than just the Japanese American community. And I'm not sort of jettisoning my Japanese American identity. It's really embracing my Japanese identity and the identity of that's represented even on this panel. It's a wonderful thing to be part of something bigger and more grandiose and important. And I try to impress upon all of my Asian American colleagues that we're part of something bigger. There's no just simple Asian American. In Massachusetts, there are 13 Asian American subgroups that have larger than 2,000 populations. So we're not just Asian American, we're something else. But the Asian American is a meaningful identity to me. It's something that I've embraced. It's something I've become. I've made it my profession.
Wow, that was a great wrap-up to that question. So for the second question I have, what have you found to be the most prevalent problems affecting your community? Does everyone have a shared struggle? Vivian, would you like to start off this discussion?
Sure. A prevalent problem in my community would probably be, although Malden boasts about being such a diverse community, and Malden High School even being voted as #1 diverse school in Massachusetts on niche.com. After my 4-ish years of experience here, I have to say that there is not a lot of integration when it comes to friend groups. We might boast about having 25% Asian, Caucasian, Blacks, Hispanics, but as far as I can see, if you don't do a sport or a club, you're bound to migrate towards friend groups that resemble the same race as you. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Of course, as humans, we want to associate ourselves with what's familiar, but in order to network, in order to make connections, and to really make the most of high school and the world, sticking with whatever you're familiar with is not always the best idea. Someone once told me that it's best to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and I think that in order to solve this problem with only sticking with your community, and there's nothing wrong with sticking in community. There's so much strength in numbers, but if you want to show that strength, you really have to reach out.
So, Paul, would you like to add as well?
Yeah, I'm often asked this question. I think in some ways, and it does really resonate with this theme that you have about the model minority myth. When people ask me what's the biggest problem with Asian Americans, and I say the biggest problem with Asian Americans is this perception that Asian Americans don't have any problems. In some ways, that really does feed this model minority assumption that all Asian Americans are not, although many are, they're not the valedictorians in their class. They're not all individuals who drive, well, I don't know what the thing is, rice rockets or whatever the hell you're supposed to, the heck you're supposed to be driving at. And we're not all, rich and fancy and so forth and all of that. There are problems, and then when people ask me, well, what are the problems? I can go into a large list, and I'll do it if you want me to. But there are many challenges that we face as Asian Americans. And part of it is part of the first question. We are different. You even talk about the struggles that Josephine, and they may not seem like struggles, but to a young woman or something, those are struggles. And we're struggles that we're feeling every day. Just think of the mental health difficulties that our community often faces. Not only the young children, but the older adults and the grandparents and parents. These are some of the hidden assumptions that don't get out there and get hidden by this model minority assumption that doesn't just include school-age kids and worrying about their schoolwork. It applies to seniors and so forth as well. And all of these things are hidden. And so I guess my simple answer is the biggest problem is this perception that Asian Americans don't have any problems.
Would anyone else like to add?
Yeah, so I mean, coming from the perspective of being in the media, I think, and building off some of what we've heard already, there's this problem of underrepresentation in the media and not feeling that who you are, who you look like, is ever reflected in the culture around you. And I mean, from a personal perspective, like, the Asian portrayals that I had growing up were figures like Long Duck Dong. I don't know if anybody remembers that. But things have changed a little bit, but that certainly continues to be an issue. I remember last year, the Asian American Journalists Association had to deal with this very racist incident on WEEI, the sports radio station, where one of the hosts, who actually was a former Patriots player, he thought it would be funny, and the station and the producers thought it would be funny if they had a little sketch where he would mock Tom Brady's agent, of all people, who happened to be Chinese American, didn't speak with a whiff of an accent, caricature him in the most racist and vile way. And that went viral, and it became a national story, and we were kind of able to play a role in pressuring that station to start implementing some changes. We worked with that host who was very apologetic after he made that, sketch. And so we were able to kind of make a positive from that, disastrous incident. But it's something that continues, and it's not just with Asian Americans. It's we see these kind of gross stereotypes applied to African Americans, LGBT people, Latino people, and what's important, I think, from my perspective, being in media and being a journalist of color, is to form coalitions with other groups, with other minorities, to make sure that when these kind of things happen, we stand up in one voice. But certainly that applies not only to Asian Americans, but to other minorities as well.
Yeah, if I could chime in a little bit, I would imagine later that for example, when I think of a problem, I always think of within group. So obviously there are issues within group, but there are also an outer group issue, as we've already talked about with the model minority myth, right? The outside group looking in and saying this group has no issues. But then there's also that interaction between the two. So I imagine we'll get to the kind of the within group stuff later. But I do want to say, just going off of what we're talking about with the representation, there's a way that we can look at representation and soften it up as if it's an option. But I want to kind of put out there today that it's actually a part of structural racism to not have representation. So let that sink in a little bit, because that really puts really strong language. Yeah. It puts a strong language behind what that is, but it's really institutional racism to not be able to walk into a space and to see myself reflected in wherever it is that I am, right? And so if we really look at it that way, then it's not optional that we would have representation. It actually should be demanded, and we should all work towards having that, and it's only the right thing to do. Borrowing words from self-psychology, because that is my field, it says that in order to thrive and to really flourish and to actually live a full life in whatever context that is, we actually need lots of things. So, for example, we need this thing called mirroring. And what that means is, if I'm looking out and I walk into a space, that means I need people to be able to mirror, right, parts of who I am. Does that make sense? So if I'm happy and I share a happy story, then I need the audience to actually mirror back my feelings. Right? And we see that happening with young babies. When you smile, the baby usually smiles back. They learn how to do this, right, as a social interaction. And so we all need that type of thing. We also need to be understood without having to explain our entire history. So if you know what that feels like, yes? To go into a deep story and then to still be met with, I don't know what you're talking about, that really does a lot for young people, older people, you name it. And so that mirroring is so important. So it really highlights the importance of that representation. And again, stressing that it's institutional racism to not have representation.
Going off of what you said about internal issues within groups, as a Filipino American, I've noticed that a huge issue that still needs to be addressed within my own community is the problem of colorism. So basically what that is favoring one skin color over another, and it's different from racism because it tends to be within the same group. So this stems from the Philippines' history with colonialism, and on an internal level, it causes insecurities within the people involved. Like myself, my aunts, my cousins, we've all had struggles with wanting to be lighter skinned because we thought it felt the standard of beauty, and it wasn't necessarily from outside, like white people. It would be from our own family members telling us that beauty was defined by having lighter skin. And then beyond internal issues, on the outside, this beauty standard and colorist tendency, it permeates into racial behavior and attitudes towards other minorities. So I've witnessed my own family members have hostile thoughts about other races because of this colorist attitude within the Filipino community.
Okay, so this question is directed toward Josephine, but if anyone else would like to answer, that'd be great. So the book, The Tea-Girl of Hummingbird Lane, touches briefly on Asian American mental health, which is something that Paul talked about briefly. And so because of your background as being a licensed mental health counselor, can you discuss like the topic of mental health within Asian American communities?
Sure. So again, I think there are within group issues and then again, the outside group and the interaction between the two. But all of the things we've talked about, you can imagine how it has an impact on our mental health. But I would say one of the key things that I see in my work and my research is what's called intergenerational conflicts. And so when we have immigrant families, for example, who come to the United States, one of the first goals, and really your achievement becomes how fast and well can you fit into a host culture, right? So many of us are trying to fit into this host culture. That means you have to acculturate, which means, again, adapt, right? Different ways of talking, different ways of behaving, different ways of dressing to fit in. But what happens is we all wear cultural lenses, and during that process of immigration, that lens shifts. And so we see with our children, for example, they're very quick to behaviorally acculturate. They acquire the language very quickly, and before long, they begin to identify themselves as I did, blonde and blue-eyed, white American, this is my home, I'm American, etc. And then you have parents who say, actually, no, I want you to have the American dream, but in the process, don't become American, right? And so in that process, what happens is the parents then try to hold on even tighter to traditions and norms because they see their children becoming more and more Americanized, and that's a threat to losing traditions and culture and etc. And so they try to hold on tighter. But that causes what's called that intergenerational conflict. And we also know, I mean, I don't want to stereotype and generalize, but Asian parents do love differently. Would you agree? If you agree, nod. Yeah? My parents would have never said, I love you, but they always ask me if I've eaten. And so anytime my mother says, have you eaten? I say, I love you too, right? Because they love through food, and this is how they love. And yet, during that process of immigration and acculturation, nobody ever teaches you that's what that means. So then children say, why does she always ask me whether I've eaten or not? But what I want is a heart-to-heart connection and some conversation here. And the parents say, I do everything for you because that's my way of loving you. And so there are some things that get lost in the translation, and because of those perceptions, I see lots of mental health issues happening. But I'll let others chime in.
So Paul, you touched on this briefly. Would you like to elaborate on what you meant?
Well, I'm going to defer to the expert here, but I think there's so much that she says is true. I think, for example, she talks about how people, and not just Asian Americans, but immigrants in general, for example, give up things, like their name. I think of my own father. His name was not Tom, but that's the name he went by, and it's sort of the name that was in the white world. But his name was Hikomune, and so to help people along, we at least called him H. Watanabe, not Tom Watanabe. But the number of times, even today in my own classroom, I'll have kids from Somalia and the Sudan and places, and they'll have complicated names, and they'll have been given Christianized names, frankly. And I'll never forget the one day the student came up to me and we talked about these names. And he just went up to the blackboard and says, this is my name, and he wrote out his name in Sudanese, and he says, this is what I want to be called from now on. He was reclaiming a part of his identity, but we had sort of forced it, you know, society says, I'm going to make it easy on you, you can call me John or something like that. But we make people give up so much of what they have. And can I just say one thing? We're even a few minutes into this. And the one thing I've seen from our younger people here, not our least wise ones, but our younger ones, they're probably wiser than we are. And there's so much debate in our society about ethnic studies and having clubs that are around issues about identity and so forth. But I just listen to the conversation that they're having, what they're teaching us, and I'm saying, where did they learn this? And they learn this by studying ethnic studies, and they learn this about studying differences and backgrounds and so forth. And what a treasure it is for us to learn from them, and how important it is to them in understanding themselves to have this. We didn't have this when I was growing up, believe me, and I think it's really an affirmation for me, just to listen to them and to see how this history and this teaching meshes with their own identity and sense of self. And I think it's a great testament for why we should be doing more of this and not less.
So if either of the youth would like to talk about the question as well as their experiences with ethnic studies.
Well, I am a part of the Asian Students in Action Club at my school, so I have dealt with researching topics that would pertain to the Asian American experience as well as the Asian experience back in the continent itself, not in America. Learning about these topics, it's been often difficult to do because there's not much out there, at least from what I can find on my computer at home. And I feel like that's something that has to be addressed. But I feel like us having this discussion, us learning about it ourselves is a way to start that conversation and make it go through.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on what Trisha said, a lot of times in a history class, I wouldn't get the opportunity to learn about Asia or anything that has to do with it. The closest I've ever gotten was probably the Middle East, if we're talking geographic-wise. But I feel that I'm glad that we're having this discussion today. It really gives me good insight of how many people who are willing to learn. I just wish that the education system would be just as eager.
And could you elaborate on the mental health aspect of the question as well?
Oh, right. Again, with the idea of misrepresentation, a lot of the time, I feel that for the black students or the African American students, they have such bigger insight on their history through world history, U.S. history, because they've been such just a huge audience throughout history, and to not down talk their experiences, but we're both minority groups, and I feel that Asians deserve a chance and a voice in history, and without that kind of identification in class, that puts harm in their mentality.
Addressing mental health, I feel like that has to do a lot with the model minority myth in the first place, because Asian students are told that, they are inherently or innately smart and able to do things with their brains and academics. So when they're placed under this stress to uphold this myth, it's a lot of mental strain on them because they feel that it's ingrained in them that they have to do well. So they're less prone to reaching out to others for help. And it also ties itself to competition among students and being unable to, band together against a struggle.
Right, just to add to that, I mean, the model minority myth, the truly damaging piece about it is that nobody ever reaches in to offer you help, and then it also limits you from reaching out to ask for help because the expectation is that you would have everything put together. I remember I was counseling a group of high schoolers one year, and one of them just slammed their books down on the table and said, "I hate Asian fail." Now, how many of you know what that is, Asian fail? Yeah. And I had never heard of it. It was maybe in 2006. And I said, "What is this Asian fail? Tell me more about this." And one of the students said, "I hate it. I fail, I Asian fail all the time. It's not something we came up with," meaning Asian students came up with, but it's something that white students came up with, they said. After a test, a white student would come up to an Asian student and say, "Hey, how'd you do?" And the Asian student, without fail, would always say, "I failed." But then when they come back later to find out, wait a minute, you got a 96 or you got a 97, but you said you failed, right? So the standards of Asian failing is so much higher, if you will. But think about what that does. And the thing is, the thing about ethnic studies that's so powerful is that when you don't have the truth, what we do is we internalize whatever stereotypes are fed to us, right? So if we're internalizing stereotypes, thinking I am indeed the model minority, then I have to live up to those standards, and indeed 96 is a fail, then again, that plays a number on you, right? And I also think, what plays into that is that so many of our immigrant parents, for example, if you think about where they immigrated from, I think the landscape has changed a little bit with the generations, but even when we were immigrating, I come from Korea, that was poverty-stricken, war-torn country, right? And survival was really key. And so if you think about survival meaning, putting food on the table, then a child who says, "Mom, I think I'm depressed these days," Well, you know what? Back then we had nothing to eat and people were dying. So let's focus here, right? It's so easy to kind of dismiss, I think, some of the struggles that our students have, and yet they're very real, right? And so that also speaks to a little bit of the within group stigma against mental illness or mental health issues, right? This idea that it's a weakness, sign of weakness to actually ask for help. It may actually be poor blood even, or even sin sometimes. And there are lots of times when I'm counseling young youth, and they'll say, you know, I finally got up the courage to tell my parents that I've been struggling and that I really don't want to live anymore, for example. And the parents would say, no, I think you're just a little lazy. If you work just a little bit harder, as if you can kind of will it away. And we know that mental health issues, it's actually a bona fide illness and a disease, and something that really makes people struggle. It's a real thing, and that it's not something you can kind of wish away, right? So again, kind of I would say mental health literacy is a little bit lacking in our communities.
I would say another pernicious element of things like the model minority myth and this notion that all Asian kids are smart is not so much how it's used for Asian American kids as the way it's used against other racial and ethnic groups. That's the pernicious element, because the view is this: look, if Asian kids, they're non-white kids, many of them are immigrant, if they can be smart, why can't you be the smart? And it's used to discipline other groups. And that's really the origins of it. At a societal level, the whole model minority myth had less to do with trying to really valorize Asian Americans at the national level and so forth. It was really fundamentally used as part of the civil rights debate of the 1960s to really discipline other groups, blacks and others within the United States. It's essentially to say, look, Asian Americans can be successful and do well in school and be the smartest kids in their class. Why can't you be it? And it really focused on, it made the argument of the dominant society to look at blacks and other groups and say, look, the issues that you are facing are the product not of structural racism and because of institutional racism, it's because of you. That's the problem. And that is so pernicious and so dangerous. And that's the roots of the model minority myth. It is a myth, but it's a myth that is used for a purpose. And the purpose is less to make Asian Americans feel good. And if we internalize it, we're making a big mistake about that. We're being blind to the own reality. But it's pernicious in the ways in which that mythology was used, not in terms of Asian Americans, but really the way in which it really systematically was utilized in the civil rights era, when we were confronted with a rising, particularly amongst our African American community, a demand for equal rights and participation, to say to that group, you're not going to get it because of your own, it's because of your own weaknesses and not because of societal structure and history and institutional racism. And that, I think, is the dangerous part of the model minority mythology.
Sure. I mean, I'll mostly defer to my esteemed colleagues here, but I would say that growing up in this area, the Boston area, I faced kind of two different types of racism. One was an overt racism, which was right in your face, could be physical. You know, I've been jumped in this community. I've been pointed at, things thrown at me. I remember trying to take my sister to Fenway Park to see a baseball game, having objects, cigarette butts thrown at me. That is one type. It's right up in your face. The other type is the type that you don't really know. You're not sure if it's racism. You know, you kind of feel that, you kind of sense it. You might feel like you're being excluded or that a door is being closed on you and you don't know why. And to me, that has affected me more, impacted me more in my life. The kind that I wasn't sure if, you know, I was the target of racism. So, I mean, the overt kind, you know, I felt like, you know, it's right up in your face. You can kind of confront it in the moment. The other kind sort of piles up on you, and that also has kind of a very sort of toxic effect.
Yeah, and we would call that a microaggression, and microaggressions have been defined as a death by 1,000 cuts. And I think that accurately describes it, yeah.
So on to to our next question. Was there ever a time where you felt as if your specific nationality, so not just Asians, your nationality now, was not represented? How can this be combated, and have you noticed within the Asian community? Young-Jin, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say growing up as a Korean American, people would all automatically assume that I was Chinese or Japanese. And I had a lot of that going up through school, like, I was the Chinese kid or something like that, but Korean wasn't part of the sort of cultural milieu, if you will. But now with Korea's, rapid rise, it's the host of the G20, it's hosted both the Winter and the Summer Olympics, you have K-pop, you have Psy, Gangnam Style, you have all it's all in the culture, right?
Can we see a demonstration, Young-Jin?
Maybe later, after. So, I mean, I do feel like Korea is part of the sort of bigger conversation now more than it used to be. I would say, though, that, within the conversation of Korea and the Korean diaspora, there are minorities within that don't get the coverage they need. So I'm thinking of like single moms in Korea, adoptees, marriage migrants who come to Korea through brokers to marry Korean men oftentimes, and they're oftentimes in very, very vulnerable situations, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot. Korea kind of has a tendency to sort of other and stigmatize and marginalize minority groups within its own culture. And I'll also mention the LGBT community as well for Koreans. That, as I was reporting on that community in Korea, I realized that I rarely met a Korean that was out, because it's so stigmatized. It would be so difficult to come out and actually still be able to keep a job and be able to be happy in that society. So I do feel that there are minorities within the Korean diaspora community that do get marginalized.
I think it's interesting being one of clearly the oldest person on this panel and having a little perspective. It's interesting, when I was growing up, so I was born 5 years after the end of World War II, and after my family got out of America's concentration camps. And it's interesting, the stereotype at that time, I mean, believe me, model minority would have been a significant upgrade. The world that I grew up with is Japanese Americans, Asian Americans were the yellow peril. Right. We were the other sort of extreme stereotype, not the valorized model minority, which is a myth, as we've all said, and has pernicious consequences. To us, we were the perpetual foreigner and the foreign threat and we had just fought World War II. So for me, it was kind of interesting that the kinds of mythology and stereotypes that the current generation are dealing with are quite different than the ones I was. And it shows you the malleability of these things. The Asian American, as a kid, when I was in high school, I don't think I was that different than these folks were, but when I was in high school, I was considered a gook and a chink and a Jap and different than everybody else, and the people who had fought World War II and threatened everybody and been the basis for throwing my family in a concentration camp, all of that was a different sort of stereotype. And so these things change, and it's really beyond our control. And the desire to gain some control, at least of our place in society, at least of our own identity, at least to own who we are as individuals, that's something we don't want to sacrifice. We don't want to be the product of society telling us that we're a yellow peril model minority. We want to be who we are. And that's it's an attempt, and I see this attempt here in this room, and I see it particularly amongst the young people, and I really applaud it.
Turn it over to the youth.
Okay, so tying back to the representation problem, I was born in this century, so the attitude towards Asian Americans.
I was born in the last century, not the previous one.
I didn't mean it like that. I'm sorry. What I meant to say was, in this age, there is a huge emphasis on social media and being active digitally and having like such a large amount of resources available to you at your fingertips. So that's made it easier for influencers within social media, such as like small Filipino artists, to get their voice out there and be heard. And that is an improvement compared to how things have been in the past, but on a larger scale, it's still very small to see how Asians are represented, because usually when Asians are represented, they're tokenized. They tend to be the side character, or they're a way of reaching a quota, not necessarily being a character who has a personality, interests, and hobbies that just also happens to be Asian. The representation is still lacking because we have all these major films, but they tend to be focused on East Asian people, not necessarily the huge amount of people that come from the continent of Asia.
And to Vivian?
Well, I can't top what Trisha said, but something that I've seen a lot happening in Malden lately is that there's been a lot of apartments being built, and when apartments are being built, a lot of residents come in, and I see that there's a trend of international Asian students, particularly Chinese. A bit of a stereotype or an assumption towards these international Chinese students is that they're rich and that they have money, that they have this type of expensive clothing, and that they like to flex sometimes. And this kind of stereotype can put harm into me, specifically because I don't have a lot of money. But because of this kind of a type of stereotype, I think it shows that it not only once again puts these Chinese students at a foreign perspective, but it shows them as other, as this kind of image of wealth, and again, it marginalizes Chinese Americans who aren't fortunate enough to afford these types of materials, or can even support their own families.
And to Josephine?
I was going to say, in higher education, there is an overrepresentation, a lot of people would say, of Asians and Asian Americans. And so they might say, why is there a need to think about, for example, affirmative action with our populations? But as an East Asian, I find that it's really my duty and my job to make sure that the vast array of Asians are represented in higher education. And so for me, I constantly bring up the question of, okay, I see a lot of East Asians or South Asians on our list, but I don't see any Pacific Islanders, or I don't see any Southeast Asians. And so it's so important to bring that in. So for me, I would say it's less about, do I see myself as a Korean American being represented? Because in higher education, again, within that bubble, there is, and of course it depends on like the major, etc. So if you're over at Longwood, where the medical school is and the dental school is, there's plenty of representation there. And yet what you won't find are Vietnamese, Cambodian students, Hmong students, refugee students, right? People who come, at different times under different circumstances. One thing about the model minority that it also ignores is exactly that, right? It ignores the time when the U.S. shut doors to immigration from Asia, and when it did open the doors again, that it only let in people that the U.S. deemed would actually be able to contribute in the ways that they thought would be productive to the U.S. And so the people they were admitting, into the country were doctors and engineers and people that, again, could really help them as they were building this country. And so that really, talk about representation, only created representation of a very select few people. And because of that stereotype, in many ways, I mean, what we know about stereotypes is that you might say, well, some of it is true. Isn't it true that, most Asians are like that? But what Chimamanda Adichie, who's a Nigerian novelist, would actually say is, it's not that stereotypes are unnecessarily or necessarily untrue. It's not the whole truth, right? It's not the full story. And so I think it's so important for us to really vouch for other Asians who are not at the table and to make sure they get a seat there.
So this next question is directed toward Young-Jin. So one of your roles in the Asian American community is, as Mona said, ensuring fair coverage. So I know you talked about the thing with Tom Brady, but what is your stance on how Asian Americans are represented in the media, and have you noticed there being a different attitude toward them?
Can you repeat the last part there?
Have you noticed there being a different attitude towards them?
That's a great question. So I would say that when we talk about fair coverage, I think for me the really key point is fair representation, as we've been talking about. And Boston is now a majority-minority city, meaning that there's more non-white folks than white folks. So the question for me is, when you turn on your local news, when you open the paper, or I don't know if people open the paper as much anymore, but go to the website at least, are you seeing the diversity of the city? Are you seeing the diversity of the communities reflected in the coverage? So one thing that I do notice, and this is really unfortunate, but we have these culturally rich areas like Dorchester and Roxbury, but the only time we ever see them, see any news coverage about those areas is when there's a violent crime. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I think the same, I think that also applies to Asian Americans living in this area. We do have a diverse set of Asian Americans living here, but when you go through the local media, do you see their stories being told? Do you see stories that impact their lives being told? When a TV reporter is reporting on the big news, and they go out and do they call man on the street interviews, where they just go up to random people and ask them questions. Do you see enough Asians? Do you see enough African Americans? Are you seeing the diversity and richness of the city being reflected? And unfortunately, I would say the answer is no, from my perspective. So for me, the big way to address this is by looking at the newsrooms themselves, and who are the people who are making editorial decisions, who's giving the green light to stories, who are the reporters that are out there on the streets getting those stories, getting the information. Because if your newsroom is not diverse, then you're not going to get diverse stories, and you're just going to get the same news cycle over and over again. So what's really important, one thing for the Asian American Journalists Association, we've created a coalition with the Black Journalists Association, the Hispanic Journalists Association, and the LGBT Journalists Association here. And we're really pushing for the news organizations, mine and all the other news organizations in this market, to be accountable for their diversity. Because a lot of places talk a big game about diversity, but when you look at what the content that's coming out, is it reflecting the diversity of this area? So to me, that's really the big question when it comes to fair coverage. And
if anyone else on the panel has stories of experiences they've had.
Can I give two media stories? One relates to what Young-Jin said a moment ago about the Asian American Journalists Association, which he's involved with. And it deals with this question of representation and this notion of whether Asian Americans, quote unquote, have any problems. I know some journalists, even in the Boston area, for example, so they have these conferences, their national conferences, and they ask their bosses in their newsrooms or in their televisions if they can get time off to go to these conferences. And I know some of the Asian Americans their bosses have said, if it's going to the Black Journalists Association, which they should, they've supported them and said, of course, we're going to support you to go to them. But when they ask to go to the Asian American Journalists Association, they say, why do you need to go to that? Mm-hmm. And I mean, I've heard these things, and it deals with this question of representation and whether you have any issues and so forth. And the second one relating to the media, I saw this study a few years ago, and it's interesting. It looked at what young Asian American kids watched on television. And one of the biggest programming that they saw on television was the news, and you thought, okay, my God, this is a model minority, they're nerdy, they're into the news. But you know, when they look deeper, the reason they liked the news is because that was the one place where you actually saw some Asian American anchors. You saw people who were giving the news. It was the one place on television where you actually saw some Asian Americans. So they were looking for television, not just for the news, they were wanting to see people like them, and they saw it, the one place they saw a little of it, not a lot of it, was as anchors and giving the news.
I have a funny story to go along with that. So that was me, actually, sitting in front of the TV watching the news because, right, it was actually Connie Chung. Anybody remember her? Yes, she was my heroine as a child, and I thought, wow, I'm going to be one day the next Connie Chung. And I took it so seriously. I actually studied broadcast journalism. I really thought I was going to be the next Connie Chung. And it wasn't until I began the ethnic studies that I realized I know why exactly I wanted to be here. She was the only person who looked like me, and I thought if she can do it, I must be able to do it, right? And so just the power media has and the importance of this type of empowerment. So important.
To Trisha or Vivian? What Vivian first this time?
Do you mind repeating the question?
Oh, so the question was stance on Asian Americans represented in media and like instances where we've seen like positive, negative coverage.
Okay. So previously to what Trisha had said about how social media has been such a big phenomenon this generation. Growing up, I was very sheltered as a child. So when I got my first phone and I made my first Instagram account, it became basically my whole life. I really loved social media, and I really loved engaging with other people, without having to leave my house. And one of the biggest, and this was big news one summer, this young girl by the name of Karen Ip becomes popular from a skit that she's made. She's Chinese, around the same age as me, and she becomes famous off of this Pokemon skit, basically. And after a while, that became her thing. She wanted to promote Asian culture, and I was all for it until it slowly started to become the only thing she was promoting. And then it slowly turned into the only thing that she was performing was Asian stereotypes recycled over and over and over again for the millions of eyes who were watching her online. And no hate, no shade towards her. I love her. But as a young girl growing up who relied heavily on social media and relied on a familiar face that became popular through social media, that wasn't something I wanted to continue looking up towards.
Okay, so similarly to Vivian, when I got my Instagram, it was very heavily flooded with Asian stories and experiences and people that I could look up to. And also adding on to that, when I was growing up, I watched cartoons like my brother did and the rest of my cousins did, but a lot of it, a lot of the TV that I was exposed to was Filipino channels themselves. But because I was exposed to that so heavily, I started turning away from it, and I started, looking down on that itself and trying to find myself more Americanized. So that kind of ties back to the first question, where I was kind of denying my culture, even though it was so heavily brought to me, and I should have been more appreciative of it.
And then this is a question directed towards the youth. So, have you seen hostility toward groups of minorities during your school career, Asians in particular, or maybe the opposite, like increased sensitivity when it comes to race, and how has this shaped your high school career? And the other panelists can answer with their prior experience.
Well, I go to Boston Latin, and that is an exam school. So basically, you have to take an entrance exam to come in. And so recently, there's been discourse about who's been accepted and who's been taking up advanced placement classes, even though those classes are available to most of the student body. And they've been mostly pinning it onto the Asian community within the school, even though the school only makes up less than 30% of the school's population. In that way, they're hostile towards the Asians within our student body. And adding on to that, more of the struggles that we face are on a smaller level. Like Josephine was saying, it's more microaggressions and things that are swept under the rug rather than things that are more overt and openly hostile towards us.
Vivian?
So I go to Malden High, and I'm a senior. I've been there all 4 years, and growing up, like I mentioned earlier, is that I I stuck out with a lot of the Asian crowd. And from what I've seen is that because our friend groups were so saturated with the same race, with the same culture, they slowly began to warp their perception of other races, and they started to become more stereotypical, becoming more more desensitized towards other races' struggles. You know, some were throwing around the N-word carelessly, some were putting down other people's experiences, and that kind of feeling you get, that drop in your stomach, wait a minute, this is wrong, I feel like this is wrong, but why? That was the kind of feeling that lingered onto me for the past couple of years. And I guess that's the kind of hostility I put towards my old Asian friend group. I believe that I shouldn't have stuck out with them just because they shared the same culture, the same experience as me. Instead, I should have left them for the way that they treated others, and they treated other minority groups.
Adding on to the tension within my school itself, it also stems from the fact that the Asian makeup of our school is within itself very diverse, and thus it lends itself to it being very divided. So one of the things that my club, Asian Students in Action, had to deal with was the fact that it was overly saturated with East Asian officers, and there was little to no representation of the South Asian clubs or the Middle Eastern club, and we felt that it wasn't within our right of mind to educate others about these cultures when we didn't represent those cultures ourselves. So I think that a huge source of at least tension in our school, or in my high school in general, is the fact that we aren't able to unite with people beyond our own ethnicities, or people who look just like us, like Vivian said.
And anyone on the other table, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah.
So to repeat that, sorry Trisha, she was asking what the audience is for Trisha's programs about Asian Americans.
Really, it depends on the size of the event that we're hosting. So some events that we have throughout the year are food events, so more than just Asians come to participate in those. And we try to incorporate as much cultural knowledge as possible as we can, but we find that we're really limited because our board is limited to such a small array of ethnicities. But then we have larger events like our upcoming Asian Night, which hopes to boast all the cultures that make up Asia, as well as the Asian American experience. So in that itself, there's a huge part of the audience that comes to see that is Asian, but also we have other races coming to enjoy that as well, as they find it entertaining and a way to grasp knowledge, but still find themselves, the content is nice for them, I guess.
Any other questions? In the front here.
Yeah, I think to kind of follow up on that question, Malden has been traditionally for the past 100 years, a community that has had a lot of immigration, and the Italian and Irish immigrated here, and they had political forces. And I think it's interesting the past 20 years there's been a big growth in the Asian community here. So how do we get that generation coming up in high school to become involved politically and directly?
You know, while that generational waiting is true, I'm really heartened by the fact that there are a lot of Asian Americans, including in the state, who are not waiting for that. You look at something like Tram Nguyen, for example, elected to the as state representative in Andover. Andover. Maria Robinson, Korean adoptee in Framingham. In Massachusetts, the state representative, the member of the state legislature who is a person of color who has the longest longevity of anybody in the Democratic Party is Asian American. It's Taki Chan. If you look at the Asian American caucus in Massachusetts, I remember it was not that long ago when there wasn't a single Asian American legislature. There are now 6. If you look at the people running for the President of the United States, you look at Kamala Harris, Asian American. You look at Tulsi Gabbard, Pacific American, Asian Pacific American. And you look at somebody like the guy named Wang, what's his name?
Andrew Yang.
Allen, I'm sorry, he's running. Another Asian American. I mean, I agree with you 100%. The representation is not there, but it's moving. And the great thing I love about it is young people like Tam Tran and so forth, they're not waiting their turn. They're not, in Massachusetts, the biggest impediment is you get politicians that serve in these positions and everybody has to wait until they die or pass away. And frankly, the Democratic Party is the biggest impediment to that. I'm just making a judgment about that. But you have the Ayanna Pressley, for example, and you have the people who are willing to say, we cannot wait, and we're not going to wait. And I think that spirit is reflected in a lot of the people. It's a spirit reflected in these younger people here as well.
Yeah, if you could come up and then just move out of the way.
I just want to say, with all due respect, Dr. Watanabe, you forgot about Michelle Wu.
You also forgot about Andrew
You
Yang.
need to mention Michelle Wu. And I just want to know, my son graduated from law school like 2005. And then 2 years later, we went to a medical school graduation. And my son at that time was like, Mom, the medical students are so diverse, the class, Northwestern. Then his law school graduation. So I just want you to know, Martin Luther King, when he was doing all his stuff, they told him, you go sit down, it's not your turn. And President Obama, when he was doing it, they said, you go and sit down, it's not your turn yet. And then guess what happened? They did not wait, just like you said.
In the front, there.
Can I say my dream is that we'll have so many Asian Americans and candidates and so forth of color that we forget them. So I, of course, know Michelle Wu, and you're absolutely right correcting me. Read the piece on Michelle Wu in the Atlantic Monthly. It's this month, I guess. It's the Atlantic Monthly. It's a great piece, and I was contacted by the reporter to write the background for that piece, but it's a great piece on Michelle Wu, so I haven't forgotten her.
You can also read a long profile of Michelle Wu by Young-Jin Kim and
Nice quote, nice quote. That was really good.
But I do have a comment for the parents in the room. I'll share a little story from my childhood where I got invited to a birthday party and it was a white neighbor's house. And, my parents, it was very difficult for them, but they allowed me to go literally because their door was right next to our door. And I remember waking up in that household, and in the morning as an 8-year-old, I was so surprised. One, to see the father with an apron, around his waist, who was cooking a meal. And then the second thing that really surprised me, because I didn't see that in my home, and then second thing that really surprised me was he said, we have omelets, we have toast, we have cereal. What do you want? And I remember thinking, you get a choice about these things? Because in my home, you didn't have a choice like that. But what that taught me was when I asked for that omelet, guess what I got? Got an omelet. And as an 80-year-old, I remember thinking, this is why you ask for what you want and you use your voice, and I didn't know I had that much power, right? And so in many ways, we can encourage this type of behavior in our homes to say, there are limits to what you can do, but within that limit, I'm going to give you two choices. What do you think works for you best, right? And so by doing that, we're instilling, and it's going to your question about how do we instill this, wait a minute, when I use my voice, it actually does something. When I say, hey, I see that we are lacking these programs, so I'm going to use my voice to do something about it, then you become more and more empowered, and then the little successes actually build into bigger successes. Yes, the reality of being an invisible minority, that's what we are in many ways. The perpetual foreigner, meaning this isn't going anywhere, even though I'm fifth generation American, right? So those things will work against us. There's also a thing called the bamboo ceiling, that just as there's a glass ceiling, there's a limit to how much people are going to allow you to take up. We're often the off-white, right? Not quite white, but still placed on a pedestal as a model minority. So all those things will definitely push against us, but one thing we can do is teach our young children, right, that they can use their voice and it has consequences, that it has power, right?
Yeah. I really love that analogy you just put out about being able to choose. For instance, when my mom asked me, hi, do you want eggs? I'm like, yeah. She's like, you want bacon? Yeah. You want ramen? Yeah. Make it yourself. And in an analogical way, it really did teach me something. I try to do everything by myself. And I'm really happy that my mom raised me to be more independent.
Awesome.
So you by the stairs? I'll just restate your question, if it's not a long one.
So my question to the panel is I'm often troubled by the lack of understanding of our history, and I'm listening to you all and I'm thinking, the beginning of our country has a lot of black marks, and I feel that in our history books and in our conversations, the invisible people are the Native Americans, and all these, treaties that were violated and Constitution which was violated by the president, with the Trail of Tears, and even in the conversation about racism.
Excuse me. Could you just wrap that? Just wrap up that idea.
So my question is, do you think that going back to the history and really facing it, and for the United States to face it, that would help, issues of racism now, present day, really face it?
So to restate that question, it was, if we face history, would it be better to deal with it, or?
The real history, going to, the invasion of the United States, or as it was at the time, and what happened after that, and if we really cover that in detail, and people understood what happened.
So
in other words, it didn't begin with Columbus.
It did not, yes. The many people the indigenous people,
Yep.
people who are here, and what they experienced at the hands of colonists, if we understood that better as a society and faced it and did reparations, how would that shift, in your mind, the issues of racism today?
Let me tell you about a project that we're doing this summer, and it makes sense maybe for teachers even in Malden. We have a project called, it's essentially looking at Boston beyond the, the Freedom Trail. Mm-hmm. And when Boston, they think of it as a historic place, they think about Paul Revere's house, and they think of Old North Church, and they think of the Constitution and so forth, which is fine. But there is so much history and so much in Boston that is beyond the Freedom Trail. And so we have a summer institute for teachers that begins in Deer Island in Boston Harbor. And why Deer Island? because that's where Native American peoples were taken, and many of them killed and are buried there in Deer Island. So that's where we start. We take teachers there and we talk about exactly the experience we talk about. And then we take them to Boston and we take them to the Josiah Quincy School in Chinatown. And they go to Josiah Quincy School, which has been there for centuries and has been the place where immigrant kids, including Chinese kids and other kids, have been educated. We take people off the beaten path. And then we take them to Roxbury and they take them to Villa Victoria to look at what's happened within the Latino community. That's what we've got to do. We've got to take people's guys off of the dominant narrative, the dominant history, the dominant understanding, and see the history that's right before our eyes, but we don't see it. It's beyond our gaze, but it's right in front of us. And so I'm all with you in terms of doing that. And just in response to one question that was raised about who, your audience for your Asian American Studies programs. I teach a class I've been teaching for about 25 years on the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. And it's interesting, when I taught this course last semester, I always get different groups of students. But in this last course, I had more students than I've ever had before, 50-something students in a course on the Japanese American incarceration. And the majority of the students were of two groups, Latinos and Arab American students. And you say, why would Latinos and Arab American students be interested in a course on the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans? I hope you see the connection. They saw a connection between what's happening to them. So yes, Asian American studies, ethnic studies can have a reach that is beyond. It's not Asian American history. When we talk about Chinese exclusion, it's not Asian American history, it's our history, it's American history.
So with that brings the end of our panel.
So this brings us to the end of our panel, and we wanted to thank some people that have made this possible. First of all, we wanted to thank Eastern Bank and Ameriprise for your sponsorship, and also Malden Core and the Chinese Culture Connection for collaborating with us. And we also wanted to thank Malden Reads for hosting this event, and the Greater Malden Asian American Community Coalition, GMAC, specifically Hannah Leiden and Yen Chit for making the fortune cookies. I don't know if you've all received those, but yeah. They taste amazing, and they must have taken a lot of work, and we really appreciate it. Secondly, Mai Du and Andrea So for introducing us to this event. And also Vivian Ho and Shayna Liu, who are sitting right here in the front, because they've guided us and they've helped us so much along the process.
And we really appreciate your coming to events like this that Malden Reads is so proud and honored to be a part of, where we're really building community and really building understanding based in part from our conversation on race last year. We definitely want to thank all of the youth who are involved in this, in addition to the panelists. In case you did not read their names, on the program we have Wilson Chow, Vivian Dang, Tricia Sequio, Emelina Tran, Thomas Tran, Mona Wang, and Hillary Wong. Thank you to all the youth and all of the adults who are helping support the youth, including Richard Chang from Boston and all the educators and all the adults who are helping to support and mentor and help build this next generation.